Tariffs, inflation, economic downturn. There's so many different regulations that are constantly coming out, and not many of them actually covered from the perspective of the creator economy, because primarily people just look at the stock market, at unemployment, at inflation. So in today's video, I want to talk about how 3 key directives or direction of travel from the current administration will affect you in the creator economy. First one, everyone's favorite, tariffs. If you're not familiar, the Trump's administration essentially established like a set of different tariffs across the entire globe. Whether you're a trade partner and long-standing ally, or you're someone we're barely dealing with, everyone gets a tariff. Now, from the perspective of how does this impact the creator economy, there are 3 direct impacts. First and foremost, tariffs make things more expensive. As much as the government or anyone else can tell you, and the pundit on the news channel, that, oh, tariffs are impacting the producers of those goods outside of the United States or the countries themselves, ultimately what happens is that tariff is essentially a fee, a tax that an importing party, say a country like China, pays to the US government to import the goods and have an ability to sell them on our market. So within the United States, what this means is that those companies essentially sell the goods at a higher cost to the local resellers, and local resellers just pass on that price increase to us, the consumer. As plain and simple. They might eat a little bit of that margin to stay competitive, but ultimately they know that everyone else who importing the same good pay the same amount of tax, so they don't have an incentive to go and eat that entire tariff. The entire incentive is just like pass it on to the consumer. What it means for us is that if you're planning to buy any sort of technology, say as a creator, obviously you have your lights, you have your microphones, your cameras, all of those things do increase in price. You might not see it immediately because these kind of products are not necessarily high volume sale products, so they're not sold as fast. So a lot of companies like B&H, like Amazon, like Best Buy, Adorama, whoever else you're buying your equipment from, they will have certain stock left, and that stock was imported at a lower pricing, so they'll be able to sell it to you at the same price. But depending on where this goes, and currently, at least as of this recording, there's some legal back and forth between the judges and the Trump administration in terms of whether those tariffs are even legal. What you will see due to this uncertainty, that companies will either be very reserved about importing more goods until they really understand whether the tariffs applies or do not, which means low stock or out of stock products for the type of equipment that you might be buying. Or it might mean that they will bring it in, but they'll in advance try to price it higher, assuming that they will have to pay a tariff on that good. So all of that really means at the end of the day for you as a creator is that any kind of equipment that you're planning, especially if it's a higher cost equipment, it might cost you extra 10, 15, 30%. So if you're trying to budget right now for the new piece of equipment that you want to invest in the near future, I would suggest start planning for at least an extra 10 to 15% price increase on whatever you budgeted for that specific item. Number 2, from the tariffs perspective, what it also affects, it affects the spending ability of our viewers. So if you are trying to purchase, say, not the equipment, but you're importing a good, right? Maybe you're making the t-shirts, you're making some other merch, you're making some sort of apparel equipment, whatever your company might be producing, chances are you're producing them outside of the United States, at least partially, or you have some inputs into your product that are being produced or manufactured externally or being, excavated from the ground externally outside of the United States. So if that's the case, if you're a US-based creator or you're a creator who's trying to sell your product in the United States, assume you're going to have to spend more on the production of that product, which also means less of a profit for you, which also means potentially you having to pass that price increase to your consumers, so your viewers, your audience, which means potentially less sales of that specific product. So from that perspective, it's another kind of like unfortunately negative from this perspective, because you can potentially assume because of this back and forth, oh, my product will not be eligible for the tariffs, but it's a bad assumption because as any other company would tell you, if you make that assumption and the tariffs are reestablished and you retrospectively have to pay for them because you imported the product during the process or the time when there was this back and forth, you might lose all of your profit to this. And depending on how high or low margin your product is, depending on how well financed your team is and your production, manufacturing, warehousing, it might really hurt your business. So unfortunately, like any other business, you should assume and try to plan for at least to have like 10 to 15% price increase on anything that you're planning to import. And obviously, you don't have to price increase anything that's currently in stock. Because of this, you will see lower revenue from your products. So this is something you have to take into account, especially if you're launching a new product. A few videos ago, when I was talking about different things that we can do, I don't remember actually the context and which video specifically it was, but if you watched it, you'll remember me saying that I would hold back right now from launching any new physical product or I would hold off from making any major investment in, say, like purchasing a ton of stock because of the uncertainty around all of this situation. But also, number three, because of all of these price increases and tariffs, and just in general, the pressures that people, like regular people in the United States, are currently feeling financially, you will see a lot less spending on your subscription services, on your digital products, on any kind of like memberships potentially. I'm sure you're seeing some cancellations already. You're seeing obviously brands pulling back, right? And that's affecting them as well. But also from the perspective of any kind of like product or service you're selling directly to your audience will be in a lot tougher financial situation to be able to afford those things. So you will see less and less spending on this. Tariffs hit them across all the product categories, right? Whether it's a food, whether it's something for the house, whether it's cleaning supplies, stuff for their cars, stuff that they need on their day-to-day. So it's no longer the case where the price are increasing on something that, it's a frivolous spending. It's something, oh, maybe I'm just treating myself. No, prices are now increasing across the board on everything that people spend their money on. So their budgets are getting tighter, which means, unfortunately, stuff that we do falls into that category of like nice to have things that are first things that are getting cut from the family budget to ensure they can afford everything else. So because of this, because of the increase of tariffs and the price increases on all the goods across the board for everyone in our audience, that audience have a lot less spending power today. And because of this, you will see a lot less revenue coming directly from your audience. So this kind of like all circles back to the fact that when it comes to these things like tariffs, as much as like pundits can tell you stuff or administration can tell you stuff that they're trying to convince you like, hey, everything is fine, company, those countries will pay. That's all BS. Consumers, and in the United States specifically, are the ones who end up being taxed with the tariff and all those price increases. So whenever you hear the tariff and you hear that the tariffs are reestablished or tariffs for certain countries are increased, if you are importing something from it, if you're buying a product from that country, or if your audience is susceptible to price increases on the day-to-day, if they're not like in some, like highest, 1% kind of like population on net worth, if they're just regular folk, every time you hear those news, immediately start thinking about the fact that you're going to see lower revenue, you're going to see lower profits, and you in general going to feel a lot more pressure due to the fact that your viewers are now feeling that economic pressure as well. Second topic, interest rates. You hear all this back and forth about we need to cut interest rates, we need to do this, we need to do that. Long story short, what interest rates are is essentially Federal Reserve Bank of the United States setting the borrowing rate for everyone else out there. So Federal Reserve can quote unquote print money, right? They can issue the money that then the rest of the economy can consume and use to invest in their businesses, right? So hypothetically, back when did like 3-4 years ago, when the interest rates were zero, it was pretty much cost you nothing to go borrow the money from the central bank and invest them in your business. And that's where you saw a lot of companies trying to do acquisitions, a lot of companies hiring and paying ridiculous salaries to people because it was so cheap to borrow cash to invest in those kind of things. But what it causes is that it introduces a lot of cash into the market. A lot of cash in the market means a lot more people can spend a lot more on the same goods. And if the quantity of goods did not increase, people willing to pay more for their goods because they have the more money, which means higher pricing, which results in inflation. Long story short, when you discover this during the Biden administration, they realize, oops, we're creating an inflation. Let's start lowering the amount of cash in the market. So they increase the interest rates, which means it's much now costly to borrow money from the central bank, which means less people borrow money, less cash in the market, less cash fighting for the same number of goods, prices hopefully stabilize. Now, in this current economic environment, this is kind of like what you need to maintain in order for you to be able to keep the inflation under the controlled amounts. The problem is, from the perspective of the current administration, they really want to cut rates. They will probably see some lower rates introduce sometime later this year. There's a lot of back and forth because of the unemployment, that hey, we need a little bit of cash in the market so that the companies can go and potentially hire more people and kind of like, introduce more people into the labor force so people can actually make money and spend through the rest of the economy. The problem with this is that the current administration really wants to like cut them to zero, and the reason being is that a lot of companies see higher kind of like, cash amount in the market is a good thing for the corporations. They'll keep telling you that, hey, this is great for the economy. The problem is that when more cash right now will be introduced into the economy, for example, the interest rates are getting cut, it's much easier and cheaper to borrow money from the central bank. For any company that's out there, if I'm a respectable CFO, chief financial officer, and I get access to cheaper cash, I'm very unlikely to spend that cash to hire more people or invest in the business, primarily because the rest of the folks who are out there, like, it doesn't mean that it's cheaper for us regular folk to borrow money. We'll still be paying the same interest rates on our credit cards, on our mortgages and things of that nature. Like, none of that will change. The borrowing price, essentially, that are interest rates from the Fed, really just affect those like millions of dollar borrowing powers that only institutional investors, corporations, and major banks can take advantage of. It doesn't really have that much of an impact on regular folk because, again, the hope is that those big banks and big corporations borrow the money for cheaper and then go and like pay us salaries and hire us and maybe lower the prices on the goods and things of that nature. But in the current economic environment, there's no guarantee that because you borrowed as a corporation extra $15 million, you can now go and hire more folk because you're not getting more revenue. That money is not making it in the hands of the people who are actually your potential customers. And for the other companies who are like, hey, will they hire more? They also cannot justify hiring more people because, again, they're not guaranteed that revenue to flow back into their company. So what you will see is that those companies who will borrow millions of dollars with a lower interest rate environment, they will simply issue dividends or pay more or do more stock buybacks, which is essentially they would buy the stock from the current stockholders at the current market price. This returns the money, but returns the money to institutional investors. Because again, a lot of people will see the jump in the stock market. They'll be like, oh, Dow Jones, NASDAQ, FTSE in London, they're all like increasing in volume and they're all in green. It's awesome. But in reality, one of the fun facts that you need to keep in mind, 93% or so of the stock out there in the world is held by institutional investors. Only 7% is held by us regular individuals in our 401ks, or maybe kind of like if you just have a market account and you just go buy your own stock and sell, day trade. From that perspective, that means that on every dollar that makes it into the market, right, if through dividend or stock buyback, 93 cents of that dollar will go to those institutional investors and the BlackRocks, Apollos of the world, pension funds, major private equity funds. All of them will get to benefit from that cash. We will see only 7 cents on it, right? So very minimal impact on the regular individuals out there. Because of this, you will see essentially all these corporations doing it, increasing their stock purchase price because people get excited like, hey, as an institutional investor, if I get a million of those shares and they issue $1 dividend, I'm going to get $1 million back. So you will actually see institutional investors benefit. You will see the traders and the brokers benefit, but not regular individuals. Long way of saying is that due to the lower interest rates, you will actually not see the benefit of more cash in the hands of your consumers. Your consumers will still feel the pressure, but moreover, we will see the increase in inflation. This will introduce more cash into the marketplace, and that cash will be dumped through the institutional investors, right? And they will essentially get to keep it. You will very likely see higher inflation in the marketplace because some of those corporations will start fighting and kind of like, again, there will be competition for the resources, the competition for maybe some of the other input materials, which again, they'll be able to afford at the higher prices because then they have access to more free cash. So at the end of the day, inflation will go up. Inflation will go up, the price of goods will go up because of the fact that they're not going to be investing and hiring individuals. Folks who are out there will not see like salary increases, and folks who are out of the job will not get a job. So all that it will mean is that the higher prices on the goods will mean they can afford less. So there'll be increased economic pressure on the regular individuals, which will then result in less spending power that they can go and invest in the creators. So it was a very long way of saying lower interest rates in the current environment of economic uncertainty and potential high inflation means bad news for us as creators, because we'll be able to essentially sell less, we'll see less subscriptions, we'll be able to only invest in so many business ideas because our viewers will not be able to consume and afford as much as we would love to have them. So in general, when you see those news and you see the market jumping up in green, know that it's jumping up in green only because of the fact that 93% of that green benefit will be benefited by those institutional investors and mega corporations, and their executives will be able to, by the way, sell their stock at a high price and potentially go and retire with millions of dollars. We will only see 7 cents of all of this. Our consumers will only see 7 cents of it. And because of the increase in inflation that will be resulted because of this large amount of cash in the market, we will actually see less spending from our viewers. The third policy I want to talk about today is recent news where the Trump administration went and acquired 10% of Intel, a chip maker, to essentially support them through this increasing competition in the chip making space to combat the fact that 95% of all the chips in the world are made in Taiwan, which is under constant military pressure from China. Now, this directly does not necessarily, from a chip making perspective, has an effect on the creator economy. But there's this lingering conversation that everyone forgot about, the fact that TikTok is currently on a selling block. And there's been a lot of back and forth about like whether it's going to get acquired, who's going to buy it, what's going to happen. The current administration keeps increasing the deadline for when the TikTok will be sold. So from that perspective, I want to talk about what happens in this situation, because I am confident if the acquisition goes through, we will see at least part of that company owned by the current administration. I think they're going to go very like communistic style, and they'll say, hey, we're going to, reverse it. We're going to nationalize part of this company, and TikTok will be like 10% owned by US government, something like this. So if that happens, what is the impact on our community, us as creators? There are a few things. One, first and foremost, when these kind of things happen, the main concern becomes is that you now start playing favorites. So from the administration perspective, like in case of Intel, now administration cannot fall flat on the face in front of the entire world and allow Intel to lose. So they'll keep throwing money at Intel. They'll keep throwing potential regulatory changes for Intel to essentially enable Intel to succeed as much as possible, even if their product will suck, which again, high possibility because they now have zero incentive to try hard because government will always bail them out. Same thing potentially will happen if, say, TikTok or I don't know, something happens and there's some sort of regulatory back and forth and somehow government takes a stake in like YouTube, right? Or some other major social media app, because of the fact that likely argument will be, we want to make sure that there's a positive influence on the audience within the United States and no foreign actor can go and affect the opinions of our citizens. So if that happens, one of the first things you're going to see is that lack of competition. Because now, say TikTok is partially owned by US government or owned by people who are very friendly to US government, now you will see some regulatory changes or things that will come through, the bills that will enable essentially a platform that is favored, that is partially owned by the government, to not have to compete as hard because a lot of things will be stuck in their favor. So less competition means less potential desire from some of these platforms to support us creators, pay us more as creators, or do things to enable us to do better things. Because at the end of the day, they'll be like, hey, government will always bail us out. If we're struggling, we'll ask them to go put rate limiter on, Instagram or YouTube Shorts to make sure only TikTok is allowed, or maybe ban different apps in school but TikTok, right? Like something silly like that. It's not unusual. I tell you, as someone who spent first 18 years of my life living in the country that did a lot of those kind of things. So trust me, if you feel like, oh, it's weird, I saw enough right now in the current administration that reminds me of, my childhood. So this is absolute possibility. Number two, because of the lack of competition, you will see the decrease in the quality of that platform. Because again, you don't have to try as hard. Every time when the government gets their hands involved in particular industries, even if they have to save them, the direct effect is that because you're supported by a big brother, you no longer have to try as hard, you no longer have to push as hard, you can go and chill, you have a job security, that the government would not want to fall flat in front of the entire world and their citizens, so they'll keep supporting you, they keep trying to do things, so you can get just kind of pull back a little bit, kick back, not work as hard, and you will see deterioration in the quality of the services. That's absolutely, it happens every single time when the government touches a country. a company. So that's absolutely kind of like a normal expected cycle of things. And number three, unfortunately, what you usually will see is that things that that platform would allow to be said on that platform will be heavily curated by what are the current political winds in that current administration. So say if TikTok is partially owned by US government, and things are being said that are critical of that current administration or points out some flaws in that current administration, they'll be very quickly deprioritized. They'll be quickly pushed down in terms of the visibility because of the fact that, again, you don't want to bite the hand that feeds you. And coming back to the first point, now that your lack of activity, your lack of needing to work hard is supported by that government and that administration, why would you do something that will anger that administration? Because you're enjoying the gravy train that they're providing. So you will essentially go and do whatever is needed to be done to keep them happy, which means less free speech, which means less creative outflow and outpour for people who might have contradictory opinions, right? The beauty of the current environment, a lot of the social media networks, is that within certain boundaries, as long as it's not obscene, like there's not much of violence or things of that nature, what the policies are, we still can freely express our opinions and have very polar opposite opinions. But unfortunately, when you take a stake in that one of those companies, depending on which side of the aisle, so to speak, your opinions belong, you will see more favoritism towards that. Like Twitter was a great example, right? With strong right wing kind of like leaning ownership. You saw how a lot of other voices were essentially deprioritized, shadow banned, and affected negatively because of the fact that they were not favoring the current ownership. So same thing will unfortunately apply. So to wrap this point up, if this happens, which I think there's a decent probability, and someone through the entire process will end up acquiring portion of TikTok, I fully expect that the US government will have a piece of that pie, which means that TikTok will become very much a platform representative of the interests of the current administration. So yeah, not too many positive things through this video, I fully realize. But again, part of my job, especially as someone who's kind of like, acting as a hopefully, operating partner to a lot of the things that you're trying to do with your business and trying to figure out the stability of your creative business, I want to cut it real. No BS, none of this kind of like, oh, I say this because I lean this way, I lean the other way. It's the reality of things, right? Tariffs increase the prices of goods, increase the cost of things for your audience. Your audience have less spending power. It affects your creative business. Inflation and higher interest, lower interest rates essentially introduces more cash, but for the institutional investors who are not going to invest in someone like you, but also will affect the spending power for your consumer, which means they'll be able to spend less and invest in you as a creator. And finally, any kind of participation from the government in any of the social media companies will mean that that company will have to lean heavier towards whatever the political winds are. So you'll have to be wary of. And if you're on that side of the aisle, hey, awesome, that's going to be good news for you. But if you represent the opposite side or you don't want to be part of that entire discussion at all, you might be caught between a rock and a hard place. So I hope this was useful. Let me know in the comment section below if there are other policies or other kind of like major news lines in the general economy and macroeconomics that you feel like never been talked about from the perspective of how it affects the creator economy, because I'm always happy to apply that lens and speak a little bit more just based on my 15 years plus of experience running business operations, but also being econ major and a finance major. So I dive deep into those subjects and I actually find them interesting. So anything that I can help you translate into the effects on the creator economy, drop them in the comment section below. Otherwise, I'll see you next Saturday. Peace.